All right, we're going to ask a question, and that is Saudi Arabia financing the destruction of Islam? I was watching a video by the late Ravi Zacharias where he's talking about how Saudi Arabia is financing all these schools of Islamic studies in Ivy League universities and other American colleges and universities.
The King of Saudi Arabia gave $10 million to Harvard University and $10 million to Georgetown to open up chairs of Islamic studies for the sake of understanding Islam and creating more understanding. The New York Times journalist said to him in January 1 issue of 2006, she looked at him and said, "So understanding is what you seek?" He said, "Yes." "Are you going to open a chair of Christian studies in Saudi Arabia?" He said, "No, we don't have any Christians in Saudi Arabia." She said, "Isn't that the point? If you want people to understand one another, and you don't understand the Christian worldview, why do you want the Christian to understand the Muslim worldview?" He said, "That's not what our donation is all about. We are here to create chairs of Islamic studies. Harvard took it, Georgetown took it, they've got chairs of Islamic studies. Where we are at Oxford is the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, one of the greatest, of which Prince Charles is a patron." Fair enough. Why is it that no Islamic country that I know of, like Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and even Iraq, and even in a moderate country like Turkey?
But what's happening can be described by Yasser Qadhi. So Yasser Qadhi, I think he's from the Houston area, where I'm from, and he gets a Princeton education. And what set this all off is that for some reason, Muslims have been claiming that there's only one Quran wherever you go. And I think that Muslims try to exploit people's ignorance. Muslims try to exploit people's ignorance when they engage in proselytization and apologetics. And I think what happens is people get confused. They go to a bookstore for a Bible and they look and there's like 30 to 50 translations. They don't understand why there's so many different versions of the Bible. So the Muslims will say, well, there's only one version of the Quran. It's the same wherever you go. I think that's where this argument came from, but I think also in the ancient texts, similar claims are made. But no text copied by hand over 1,000 years is not going to have textual variance. It's just the nature of the scribe and human error. If the Quran was inscribed on tablets somewhere, but if you're passing it on by hand, written by men, then you're going to have variations, textual variations. And there's no book in the world that was transmitted by hand that doesn't have textual variance. And we've been studying this openly and honestly with the Bible for hundreds of years, and it's well known. And using scientific techniques, Bible scholars believe they've been able to reconstruct the text of the Bible with a high level of certainty. But Muslims make this claim, and what happened was, Hatun Tash, she collected over 30 Qurans she purchased across the Islamic world, and every single one of them is different, and they found over 90,000 textual variants. And Muslims have been strongly indoctrinated. There's only one Quran, and even their diacritical marks are all the same. And so when they open it and they show people, the Muslims just turn and run away. So they've been making this claim for the perfect preservation of the Quran. And Mr. Qadhi has been doing the same thing. But what he says when he's confronted with the issue, like, this is really destroying people's faith in Islam, because they've been making this claim for well over 100 years among the mass of Muslims. So when they're shown the reality that there's all kinds of textual variants between different Qurans, it just caused a lot of confusion and doubt. And people, what they do, this is really funny. Hatun Tash goes out there, and now when they see her, they just turn and run away. So what you have Hyde Park in England, where they have the free speech, speaker's corner. And for over 100 years, I think it's like 150 years, people have been going there and voicing their beliefs. And the Muslims have basically, radical Islamist Sharia activists have taken over Hyde Park. But never fear, if you want to clear it out, just send Hatun Tash. Whenever they see her coming, they just turn and run. They scatter like cockroaches. So back to the issue. So Ravi Zacharias was talking about, here we have these Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, creating schools of Islam in American universities, and these universities are accepting the money gladly. But what's happening is now we have a scientific approach to the study of Islam, and you have non-Muslims studying Islam. And a lot of discoveries are being made, such as, the Quran developed over decades, and there's a lot of evidence to show that, and that's also borne out by the fact that there's all kinds of variants, thousands of variants in different versions of the Quran. You have the Sanaa manuscript. And then another thing that's kind of surprising, I was reading this book called The Death of the Prophet, where contemporary accounts of the rise of Islam don't say anything about Muhammad or Islam at all. Islam doesn't appear until late in the 7th century, the 690s, and Muhammad was supposed to have died in 632, but the contemporaneous evidence has him living and being in what we call the land of Israel today in the year 634. So this means that the biography of Muhammad evolved and developed over the decades, and so did the Quran. And David Holland dealt with this in his book about, he mentions it in the book Dominion about the rise of Christianity. It's influenced the world, but also in a documentary and a book he wrote on Islam. And he seems to be quite surprised because people take these Islamic accounts at face value, but when you start doing research, you realize, as Mr. Qadi discovered, that there are holes in the narrative and they can't deal with it. Since we know now that the biography of Muhammad evolved over decades, as did the Quran, that's what the evidence shows. So what's happening is, Mr. Qadi described having a crisis of faith, realizing that he believed the perfect preservation of the Quran, but looking at the textual evidence, it's just not true. Or, like he says, there's holes in the narrative.
And what is your position in relation to preservation of Quran? Is, for example, Hafs an Asim, riwayat Hafs an Asim, do you see it as preserved, munazzal from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or do you not see that as munazzal? What's your position?
Jayid. Okay, so first and foremost, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna nahnu nazzal dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. So we believe, as a matter of theology, as a matter of aqeedah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preserved the Quran, no question about it. Now, as for the issue itself, every single student of knowledge knows, who studies ulum al-Quran, that the most difficult topics are ahruf and qira'at, and the concept of ahruf and the reality of ahruf, and the relationship of the Uthmanic Mus'haf with the ahruf, and the preservation of the ahruf. Is it 1, is it 3, is it 7? And the relationship of the qira'at to the ahruf. This is a topic that when you're the beginning student of knowledge, you're like, what is all of this going on here? When you go a little bit more, you learn to simply memorize what your teachers say and regurgitate it out, and you don't fully comprehend. When you do a deep dive is when things get very, very awkward and difficult. And this isn't new. This is from the time of the Sahaba. And this is not a joke, brothers and sisters. The issue of ahruf and qira'at caused confusion to somebody whom the Prophet ﷺ said, if you want to listen to the Quran directly, listen to Ubay. I mentioned the crises that happened to me at Yale, my first year at Yale. It wasn't a crisis of faith, by the way, so I was very clear about this. People misinterpreted. It was a crisis of my understanding of knowledge. It was a crisis of what my teachers taught me. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, as somebody who memorized the Quran as a teenager, alhamdulillah, in my entire life, I have never doubted that the Quran is divine. You cannot doubt that. And you listen to it, you recite it, you just cannot doubt that. It's never been an issue. This was the issue. That the issue of ahruf and preservation and qira'at and relationships between them, these are very, very difficult issues. And the most advanced of our scholars, they're not quite fully certain how to solve all of the unanswered questions in there. These issues should only be discussed amongst people who know what the qira'at are and who understand some of these questions that are being raised. Traditional understandings of ahruf and qira'at cannot answer some of these pressing questions that are now being poked by our people outside of, by our academics, by their academics outside of the faith tradition. You see, in a Muslim environment, there's always some respect that we have for the Quran. We should. In a Muslim environment, we'll press a little bit and then we'll say, okay, khalas, sami'na wa ata'na. And that's great, alhamdulillah. When you go to academia, they don't have that red line. And they're going to just, you know, the famous story of the emperor with no clothes. They're going to just point out, no, that doesn't make any sense. Well, that's not true, and this and that. And they'll bring issues, which I'm not going to mention explicitly, that you know are true because they're in your own books. They're not inventing anything new. And it's very clear to you and to every single very advanced student and specialist that the standard narrative has holes in it. That's what I'm going to say. The standard narrative does not answer some very pressing questions. You know, these are now well known within the Western Academy that they're bringing forth issues. Their level of now knowledge is leaps and bounds above what it used to be, 100 years ago. And by and large, our ulama in the Eastern world are not aware, by and large, of what's going on in the Western side of things, and they're not answering those questions in a manner that it needs to be answered. And this is something all of us that are in academia fully acknowledge. We actually, issues of the relationship, of the origins, of the ikhtilaf and all of this should only be discussed amongst those who are familiar with this science. It takes a while. I can't answer this question in a 20-minute interview, nor is it wise to do so, which is why I never brought this topic up myself. You will not find one lecture of mine about this issue. It should never be brought up in public. And I don't like these idiots, and they are idiots, wallahi. This is not something you discuss amongst the masses, ya akhi. It's not wise. You don't understand qira'at, let it be. It's wise. That's why I never did it. It's the Western academics. These problems are now becoming mainstream. Twitter has so many accounts of Quran experts, and they're non-Muslims, and they're just saying things.
Let me ask you one question to try and make this as specific as possible. I think if I were to give you a blank mushaf, and tell you to write what is munazzal verbatim from Allah into that mushaf with no human interference, would you write something which corresponds?
It's not an easy answer. It's not an easy yes or no. It is enough for the Muslim to believe that the
I think
Quran
this should be an easy yes or no, though. Yes, Khadi. I have to.
Okay, very, very well. So, Ya Muhammad, after we get off this phone call, me and you, let's have a number of discussions. No problem. I'm very open with advanced students. But these issues should not... Look, it is Kalamullah, what is going to be written. It is Kalamullah. It is
what would you write?
You're pushing me. And I'm saying it's not hikmah to... Listen, I have a condition, like I said, everything I say is going to be factual. The Quran is the uncreated speech of Allah. The Quran is preserved. The Quran is known. The Quran is mutawatir. And alhamdulillah, all of the qira'at are the Quran. All of the qira'at are authentic. Alhamdulillah. Leave it at that, ya akhi. Beyond this, honestly, I have no problem. We'll have discussions or take my class. It is enough for the Muslim to know that the Quran is the speech of Allah that has been protected, and what we recite is the kalam of Allah. That is enough for the Muslim.
Yeah, but then if I could push back here just a little bit, I know this is, I don't want to make it uncomfortable, but it's just to make things clearer. Right? If someone gave you a Quran which is empty in terms of there's nothing on it, and gave you a pen, obviously you have the Quran, but the question is, would what you write in that mushaf correspond with anything that we have in terms of the riwayat and the qira'at?
Who's going to bring a new Quran? A'udhu billah. We're going to have the Quran there, but which qira'ah will it be in? It'll be probably a mixture, right? It's not going to be necessarily... Fine. Yeah, okay, so let's leave it at that then. It's not going to be the exact Hafs and Asim bi riwayati fulan or Shu'ba.
But you would have something which you could say is sahih.
Fully recognizable by the average Muslim, obviously.
So when you write, so just to be clear, if you write down, it might not be a standard Hafs and Asim.
Exactly, yes.
But what you write down will be, is recognizable, and you believe that everything within that is munazzal min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
100%, as Allah is my witness. 100%, that is the belief.
Here you have the hadith and the surah, these biographies of Muhammad, but these don't appear until over 100 years after Muhammad is believed to have died, and there's no contemporaneous evidence of Islam at all. So this is, like I said, it's kind of amazing. How are they going to deal with these issues? These were issues that were discovered with the scientific, historical investigation and research into Islam's origin. So Saudi Arabia pays, for these institutions of higher learning to study Islam. And what they're doing is they're not intentionally, but just through historical research and the rigors of academia, the foundations of Islam are collapsing in the academic setting. So Saudi Arabia is like, oh, we're going to spread Islam through American and British academia and these schools of higher education, and we'll promote Islam through schools of Islam. And when they approach the historical study of Islam, all these questions are risen. And can Islam withstand this rigorous investigation and these questionings? Well, with the Tumtash, she just asked these questions, and all the Muslims they literally turn and run, or they try to ignore her. And in the end, they always run away from her. She can just empty out just by asking questions that were raised in academia. So it's kind of amazing that this is happening. Of course, Mr. Qadi's questions, he discovered this crisis of faith through studying Islam scientifically. So ironically, Saudi Arabia is trying to increase and cause Islam to grow and spread through founding schools of Islam. But it ends up attacking the very foundations of Islam and destroying many people's faith because it cannot withstand questioning. And like Mr. Qadi says, as a Muslim, they have a red line. The Quran says this, that settles it. But these people in academia, they don't stop at the red line. They pursue the evidence wherever it goes. So can Islam withstand historical research and scholarly questioning? It doesn't seem to be able to. Now they're in a crisis of faith, and it's very interesting that they financed this, what ends up to be an attack on Islam themselves. So the question is, can Islam withstand scientific, historical, and archaeological scrutiny? When you take what Muslims consider Islam's oldest, most trustworthy sources, and you hold them up to scientific scrutiny, looking at historical facts and contemporary evidence, then there's a lot of questions, holes in the narrative. And can they be answered? I think it's very interesting that the Saudi Arabian royal family spends millions upon millions of dollars to create Islamic learning in the West, only for these institutions to discover holes in the narrative that leads to a crisis for Islam and has resulted in many Muslims denying the faith, or one woman going to Speaker's Corner, and when all the Muslim proselytizers and missionaries are out there preaching the Quran, they see her coming with some documentary evidence to ask them questions. To ask legitimate questions, they turn tail and run as fast as they can. You realize that there's a great crisis for Islam today, and there might not be a solution to the problem of holes in the narratives of the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadiths, and what the historical record says.